Good morning. I think we're ready to resume with Mr. Calderwood. Mr.
Correct,
Connell?
Lord.
Good morning, Mr. Calderwood.
Good morning, Lord.
Now, as you understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who's sitting opposite you. But first, I understand you've agreed to take the oath.
I have, yes.
Right. Can I ask you, sitting where you are, to raise your right hand? Repeat these words after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Calderwood. Now, your evidence is scheduled for today and tomorrow. Whether it takes that time, we'll simply have to see. We take a coffee break at about 11:30 during the morning, and we'll take a lunch break at 1. If at any time you want to take a break, just give me an indication and we'll take a break.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Connell.
Good morning, Mr. Calderwood. I'm going to start by asking you the formal question I always ask witnesses, which is this, that you have produced a witness statement for the inquiry. Are you content to adopt that witness statement as part of your evidence?
Yes, the witness statement in front is my answers to a series of questions and supplementary questions that I was asked over 3 sessions with lawyers from the inquiry. They do come across as being a bit repetitive and out of sync, but it was just the way they have been recorded.
But I need to ask you just to deal with the formal question. I accept that the witness statement is long and at times, as you say, doesn't seem to be logically ordered at every point. Let's never mind who's responsible for that, it's ours ultimately. But are you content to accept it as part of your evidence to the inquiry?
I am indeed, yes.
Now, I'm going to use the witness statement as we go through the evidence. I'll ask you some early questions and then we'll perhaps try and pick up some themes or topics. If I do that, it will probably involve hopping around for the reason you just mentioned to different parts of the witness statement. So if you just bear with me as we do that. If I raise a point that you think I'm missing your answer, I'm not picking up correctly what your answer is, or you've said something better somewhere else, please simply indicate that and we'll try and deal with it. It may be a slightly untidy process, but I'm sure we'll get there in the end. Now, if we could have the witness statement on screen, it's on page 3 of the witness statement bundle. Just to deal with the, if you like, the formal background, you were Chief Executive of NHS GGC from, I think, the 1st of April 2009 to the 31st of March 2017.
That is correct.
So that's from before, for our purposes, from before the contract was signed to build a new hospital to after it had opened.
Correct.
And essentially your career, which you deal with in the early parts of your witness statement, and also by providing a skeleton CV at the back, is essentially one of being an administrator in the healthcare world. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Over a very long period, in fact, 45 years, you say?
Yes, yeah.
Now, prior to being the chief executive, you were the chief operating officer, is that correct?
Yes, I was Chief Operating Officer for initially Greater Glasgow Health Board in October 2005, and then we became Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board on the 1st of April 2006, and I continued as Chief Operating Officer until I was appointed Chief Executive in April 2009.
And just so we get that, on the next page of your witness statement, when you're asked essentially what was your job as Chief Operating Officer, you say that you were in charge of the management of the acute hospital services within initially Greater Glasgow, is that right?
Correct, yes.
So you say your responsibility was to oversee the day-to-day running of all of the hospitals.
Correct.
That if we said, what did you do, that was essentially what you did as COO.
Yes, I mean, yes, in the context of the Chief Operating Officer's key remits, that was to look after the acute services.
And then obviously you became Chief Executive. Now, I suppose what I need to ask you is quite a broad question about that. If we look on to page 5, just so we have some context for it, where you talk about being a Chief Executive and there being schemes of delegation beneath that. Ultimately, did the responsibility for building the new hospital land on you?
In the context that the Chief Executive reports through the board to the Health Secretary in Parliament, then yes, all reporting arrangements come back. The schemes of delegation which were set up in response to standing financial instructions, standing administrative orders or Scottish Government directives, they set out the day-to-day responsibility for discharging those responsibilities.
But ultimately, if the buck worked its way up the ladder, it would, to mix my metaphors, it would land on your desk and stop with you.
Yes.
Yeah. I have to ask you this because of the context in which this inquiry is operating, which is of unfortunate circumstances. I'm not using that to belittle what these were, but just as a convenient adjective. Does that mean then that if what was delivered as a hospital turned out to be not in compliance with guidelines or not what the board actually hoped for, ultimately that responsibility was yours?
Well, that would depend on the context of the issue we were discussing and whose day-to-day responsibility that was. It could well be that as Chief Executive I would be instructed by the Health Board to deal with any poor performance in relation to a senior member of staff who had that day-to-day responsibility. But if the board were to take the view that I had not followed through on my responsibilities to see it, then yes, the ultimate responsibility would lie with the Chief Executive.
I just want to ask you one or two other preliminary questions before we turn to some of the sort of themes that emerge and repeat in your statement. In paragraph 8, you're asked about some of the processes that were in place at the time that you were Chief Executive. And you say at the end of paragraph 8, the Performance Review Group was the major subcommittee of the board. Now, just tell us why that was an important subcommittee.
Basically, the structure of the board and its subcommittees was reviewed by the chairman and the board members on a fairly regular basis. But at the time in question, when I became Chief Executive, the Performance Review Group was the major subcommittee of the board, and within the board's scheme of delegation, they were allowed to take a number of executive decisions in the absence of the papers going to the full board. That board, that committee, as I mentioned in the statement, met on a monthly basis in private, whereas the board meetings were public meetings to which the public attended, and therefore when the board members wished to get into much more sensitive information, it was pertinent to take it through the Performance Review Group.
We just look at bundle 42, please, volume 4, page 46. Is this the kind of document that you would be accustomed to see when you were there as chief executive, an annual report from IPC?
No.
No, it wasn't done. Okay, thank you. We can take that down. Now you go on in the next paragraph of your witness statement to explain some of the practicalities of operating the different systems, what the board would and wouldn't do. And you try, I think, to give a flavour in these paragraphs of what the board was inclined to get into and what it tended not to do. And you mentioned, in fact, in paragraph 14 on page 7, the acute services strategy. Now, we've heard something about this from other witnesses. That this was a document which had to go up to the health secretary as your strategy for dealing with acute services within the board area. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then you talk about what we've heard described as something of a shift towards ambulatory care. So the idea that you can have hospitals which are not designed for people to stay in, but are designed for people to attend for treatment and then leave the same day.
That's correct.
Because that then leads to a point that we'll perhaps come back to later, which is that because your strategies of that kind go all the way up to the cabinet secretary, that means that different cabinet secretaries may take different views about any strategy that the board has put forward. Is that right?
Yes, the acute services strategy evolved over the period 2000, from late 1999 through 2000, 2001. It then took on different aspects of the acute services review through 2003, 4, 5, ultimately resulting in the decision to set out what it was going to be on the new Queen Elizabeth University Hospital campus, and that involved 2 health secretaries at the time.
Yeah. I think I'm right in saying that originally there wasn't going to be a children's hospital there, but that was effectively a decision that was pressed by somebody at cabinet secretary level.
Yes, the background to the board's acute service strategy was we first of all looked at adult acute services. That at that time Glasgow had 5 major inpatient units, and the whole process of this was to modernise these services, but also get fit for purpose healthcare buildings. So the first phase of that strategy was looking at adult acute services, which resulted in the recommendation that the board would concentrate on 2 major acute receiving sites. The other 3 would close and be replaced by these ambulatory care hospitals. So that was phase 1, and that was the strategy that went through the health secretary at the time, which was Susan Deakin, and went to ultimately a parliamentary vote because of the closure of 3 major hospitals within the Greater Glasgow Calderwood area. Phase 2 was then looking at laboratory services to support that configuration. Phase 3 was looking at maternity services. And it was during phase 3, looking at maternity services, where the board took the decision to recommend the closure of the Queen Mother's Hospital, which was co-located on the then York Hill campus. And at that time, Malcolm Chisholm, who was the health secretary, took the view that we should include moving the Children's Hospital to be beside the new maternity services and the new adult acute site. So that was how the thing politically and operationally evolved.
And I think you point out, if we go to page 8, that when there was a change of political party paragraph 19 rather, the new Cabinet Secretary appeared and said that she didn't like your acute services strategy, but in any event, you're not going to get doing PFI anymore for any projects that you have in mind. So that altered the procurement approach, is that right?
Correct, yes.
You say it, so just so I'm sure I understand what you're saying, in paragraph 20, in financial terms, that made the procurement strategy easier in the short term. Why did avoiding PFI make it easier?
It's fundamentally the financial aspects of PFI. In those days, in simple terms, for every £100 million you borrowed through a PFI funded project, you incurred a revenue cost of about £10 million a year. Under capital funding, where you get treasury funding, the payback on the capital investment is the depreciation over the 60 years of the building. So in revenue terms to the health board, on a day-to-day basis, it's cheaper to have treasury funding. But as I say in the statement, you can't guarantee over the life of the building that you will always access future capital for backlog maintenance and maintaining it. So in financial terms, had we gone down the PFI route, the board would have to have identified significant savings per annum to be made available to pay the PFI consortia costs. So that made the phase going forward from 2008 in revenue terms easier to plan for.
The one thing that would change, of course, moving from PFI to a traditional form of funding would be, as you say, that the maintenance role, which would be picked up by the PFI consortium, now has to be picked up by the board. Is that right?
The assumption in the business case is it will be picked up by the board, but the board receives capital funding annually set by Parliament and the Health Secretary. So the board cannot be certain what its capital allocation in future years will be. But in the context of the business case, the assumption in the business case is that you will get access to future years' capital to maintain the building safely.
Does that quite answer the question? If I understood the question.
Well, maybe I'm just not understanding the answer, my lord. That may be my fault.
As I understood the question was, you were asking that in a PFI project, part of what the client gets is the maintenance of the facility. Now, that's what I thought you were asking about. If I've understood the answer, it was in terms of the funding of the cost.
It may be we've just got slightly at cross purposes in our communications, Mr. Calderwood, and the fault is probably mine. I think the first point I was trying to pick up was, am I right in understanding that under a traditional contract, the party responsible for maintaining, looking after, dealing with the building then went back to being the health board?
That's correct.
Yeah. And what you were telling me, as I understand it, was that that was the basis on which the business case would read. The health board have to do this task, but you get financial funding from government each year.
Correct.
And am I right in understanding that the point you were making is you weren't sure how much you would necessarily get each year?
Yes, as I set out, I've tried to set out in paragraph 21, backlog maintenance is an annual allocation alongside the board's revenue funding, and that is determined by the Parliament voting how much it is setting aside for health in both revenue and capital terms per annum. So that was a variable number, and I think you may have seen Audit Scotland has continually over the years commented on the perceived extent of the deficit of backlog maintenance in healthcare premises in Scotland.
Why do you call it backlog maintenance? Because that, if you were operating just a normal little business, you would maintain the premises, and then you would discover that there was something that you hadn't done, and you would call that a backlog.
Yeah, well, in the context of PFI versus Treasury funding, PFI does not do day-to-day maintenance, repairing a broken tile or replacing the theatre lights. That is routine maintenance, which would be undertaken by the NHS staff. Backlog maintenance is, say, at year 25, you are replacing major elements of the mechanical and electrical systems. That in year 15, you're replacing all of the windows in a certain unit. These are big life cycle maintenance issues that in PFI contracts, the PFI consortia have to pay for at that point. So there's a difference between day-to-day maintenance, which always remains the responsibility of the Health Board and its revenue allocations, and major elements of estate replacement, which were or are referred to as backlog maintenance schemes.
Well, I'm going to come back to this point a little later, but so I'll just ask one more question about it. If you have a new hospital that is being built under PFI, the operating company, just call it part of the same consortium for the sake of argument,
Yep.
some often a different legal entity, but often part of the same group. It takes possession of the hospital from the part of the group that's built it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
The PFI company that you enter into a contract with is more or less an off-the-shelf company. Yeah. They subcontract the construction and the design. They bring the money in, and that's the company that you deal with through the life cycle of the building. They may not bring back the original construction contractor to do major backlog maintenance or major recycling replacement programs.
I'm just thinking of the job of saying on day 99, here's a hospital nearly built. Day 100, here it is, up and ready to go. That's all done by the PFI consortium, making sure it's up and ready, all kitted out and operational. Is that right?
No, they would only seek to hand it over to the health body. The health body would still have to ensure that all of the facilities were clinically operable.
And if they weren't?
The consortia would be required to make any changes or improvements. Okay. But the same in Treasury funding, at that stage, the same applies in Treasury funding under the defects liability period, which in the context of this scheme was 2 years.
We'll come back to that topic, I think. I want to ask you about a topic concerned with water and water safety. Now, you'll understand that a lot of the topics that I'm going to ask you about, I'll try and deal with them roughly in chronological order, although I probably won't succeed entirely. But a lot of the topics I'm going to ask you about have been driven by the issues that the inquiry has been asked to look into. And one of them is water and water safety. I'd just like to look at what you've said on this topic. Can we go to page 12, paragraph 35, where you're asked about a Scottish guidance document, SHTM 0401, and you say in your witness statement you'd never seen it before. So before you were having the discussions about the preparation of this witness statement, and then you say, I don't believe I was under any requirement under this document, but I would expect it would be delegated for the various executive lines of responsibility. I don't know where that delegation would be set out. Now, would you think is it not quite a surprising answer to give that the standing Scottish guidance on water safety for healthcare premises was something you hadn't seen before?
In the context of the question I was asked, which was, had I seen this particular document? The answer was, I hadn't. In relation to the second question, which was, I don't know where the delegation was set out, the question I was asked was, where could the inquiry look to see where the scheme of delegation was? If you look at the document and subsequent documents that are in the papers I've been sent to look at, the scheme of delegation is set out schematically in a number of those documents, which sees the responsibility from the chief executive being cascaded down and delegated, and through the Water Safety Committee and through the Chief Operating Officer and through ultimately the hospital directors and the hospital estates staff. The role of the Chief Executive would be exception reporting, so things would come up to the Chief Executive and therefore the board in exception reporting.
Well, can we just maybe have a look at SHTM 0401? So that's bundle 15, document 5 at page 381. 381 is the front page, so that's just to tell us what its formal title is. Perhaps if we went to 386. Perhaps you'd see in the second narrative paragraph there, healthcare providers have a duty of care to ensure that appropriate engineering governance arrangements are in place and are managed effectively, and then goes on to explain that this document will deal with a lot of that. So that's a duty of care that's said to be incumbent on the board as a healthcare provider. Do you agree?
Yes, and the board delegated that responsibility through a scheme and would expect to get reports back where the board was not compliant. And later in the document, there is a schematic that sets out how that would be normally achieved.
Can we go to 394? What that starts out by doing is pointing out this is a management responsibility, and management is the overall responsibility for implementing procedures to ensure that the water basically is safe. And it talks about the L8 system for looking after Legionella, a need for a written scheme. And it says these procedures should demonstrate that any person on whom the statutory duty falls has fully appreciated the requirement to provide an adequate supply of hot and cold water of suitable quality. Now, if we then go on to 416, you see in paragraph 6.3, there's a reference there to the chief executive being the duty holder.
Yes.
Is that not an indication that whoever happens to be the chief executive at the time has the let's call it a legal responsibility for this process?
No, they have in my opinion, they have a legal responsibility to set up a scheme to deliver the responsibilities for that. In an organisation, the chief executive of an NHS board, particularly the size of Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board, at that time there were some 46,000 staff. There were 18 direct reports to the chief executive and a budget of over £3 billion. It is impossible for a single post holder to personally discharge all of these responsibilities.
Well, I think we can understand the concept that you need to delegate.
Yeah.
But am I not right in thinking that doesn't alter the fact that the chief executive remains the duty holder?
Well, I can't disagree with the fact that through exception reporting, the chief executive should be made aware where there is a failure to comply, and it would then be their responsibility to work with the teams to resolve the area where we were not in compliance. And that might well be issues of money and or personnel. But it is not possible for the chief executive to personally know and have the skill set to take forward these very specific and technical areas of responsibility.
I think I can understand that, but I mean, just looking at the text, management is defined as the owner, occupier, employer, general manager, chief executive, or other person who is ultimately accountable. Now, if we take just for the moment that management with that definition would include the board, going to 6.3 and the first bullet, management, for the moment, let's think of that as the board, are required to have evidence of commitment and structure to meet the regulatory requirements and a scheme setting in writing the detail of the principles and procedures for managing and controlling legionellosis and water safety risks. This will involve ensuring the chief executive and management teams are aware of and coordinate the policy and are familiar with their devolved responsibilities, duties, and relevant procedures. Now, I take the point that the chief executive of Greater Glasgow and Clyde is a person with many responsibilities. And no doubt it's not necessarily practical for that person to personally discharge them or possibly personally make himself or herself aware. But what this document seems to say is that the board has a responsibility to ensure that the chief executive is aware of his duties. Now, I take the point that being aware of your duties is not the same as discharging these duties. Mm-hmm. But if you are not aware of the existence of this document, has there not been a failure somewhere in bringing this document and your duties to your attention?
There may well have been a situation where when this document came in July 2014, the board's responsibilities to go over the document and ensure that the scheme we had in place was compliant would be an exercise that would be undertaken. And I have seen in the context of this a schematic which sets out Greater Glasgow and Clyde's responsibilities, naming the post holders, and it's quite a substantial scheme. To the extent that in answering this question, I said I personally had not had that document put in my desk, That is correct. The board secretariat would deal with incoming correspondence, would set up a system whereby it was sent out for people to confirm what were the actions of the board and were they still compliant. But yes, ultimately, the role comes back to the chief executive to make sure that that's in place. And if it wasn't in place, then clearly it would be the chief executive's responsibility. My understanding within Greater Glasgow and Clyde is that we had a substantive scheme which set out these roles and responsibilities, and that the Water Safety Committee met, chaired by the Director of Estates and Facilities, and that these duties were discharged.
Do I correctly understand your evidence that, as a matter of historical fact, you were not aware of, well, first question, were you aware that you were the duty holder?
Not in the way it's set out in this document, no.
Yeah. And if you were not aware of the duty holder, you would not be aware of the duties?
That would be correct.
And the reason for that is no one made you aware of it?
The reason for that, yes, is that the board had a scheme in place. It was checked. It was deemed to be compliant, and there was no exception report sent to me to suggest that I had to take action.
Now, you said you drew our attention to the fact that this is a document of July 2014. I think I'm right in saying it's not the first edition of SHTM 0401.
There would have been earlier versions of water safety and the requirements to take on board learning across the public sector. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Connell.
I think the question being put to you is essentially around this proposition, Mr. Calderwood. Whoever, the drafters of this document seem to have intended that the chief executive should have the words "the duty holder" attached to them, and that should actually mean something. Now, if the board doesn't tell you and you don't find out, that's potentially quite a significant issue, is it not? Because the person responsible ultimately is not on top of the issues.
I can't comment on how Health Facility Scotland would have drafted the documentation. They use the term duty holder at both levels of chief executive and management teams.
Let's just go on to 417 before we leave the document, because one of the issues that's arisen in the inquiry, Mr. Calderwood, is that there are a series of officers supposed to be appointed to different posts, authorised persons, responsible persons, and so on and so forth, and that wasn't actually turned out all in place at the time the new hospital was set up. Now, am I right in understanding from your evidence that no one ever said to you as the duty holder that some of these things haven't been done?
That is correct. As I've alluded to elsewhere in my statement, in the period from the beginning of 2015, we amalgamated 3 hospitals into the new well, 4 including the Children's Hospital, into the new Queen Elizabeth campus. The various directors went about appointing their teams in preparation for the hospital opening in May 2015. The Director of Estates would have been expected to appoint the new senior maintenance and estate staff to the Queen Elizabeth campus, and to make the appropriate appointments to the authorised persons, water, etc., and ensure that they had the skills and competencies to discharge those responsibilities. On a day-to-day basis, that would not necessarily have been reported to me at all in the context of who was successfully appointed to which post.
Well, I can see that if things are going in accordance with the requirements, it wouldn't necessarily be reported to you, but did you use the phrase exception reporting to indicate circumstances in which something would come to you?
Yes, I did.
So if something wasn't done, that should be reported to you as the duty holder.
Correct.
And do you remember any exception reportings about the system of appointments for the new hospital coming to your attention?
None at all.
Now, just so we're clear on what you've said about water responsibilities, which, as I mentioned at the outset, appears at various points. If we go to page, we take that document down, thank you very much. We go to page 23. Now, this has become an issue of controversy at various levels, and we'll come back to why in a moment. But if we go to paragraph 81, forget validation for the moment, because that's a different topic we'll come to. You weren't aware of the come from LAP occupational risk assessment. Now, that what we're actually talking about there is a water risk assessment for Legionella purposes for the new hospital. You weren't aware that that was required?
Not specifically. I was aware. Aware is the wrong phrase. The commissioning process set out a whole series of steps that should be taken by the operational teams to assure that the building was fit for clinical services to be moved in. The reference to LAP, occupational risk assessment, I was not aware of that particular phrase. The requirement to have the water systems validated would be an essential part of the commissioning programme.
Just for completeness, in the next paragraph you say, well, I was recorded as duty holder, but that was the extent of my personal involvement. Because am I right in thinking that you weren't told of your duty holder's responsibilities and you didn't find out about them when you became chief executive? Am I correct on both counts?
I've tried to explain that the roles and responsibility of the chief executive, specifically in relation to the water systems policy, I did not execute any tasks or take on any personal responsibilities as chief executive. I was assured that the systems and the staff were in place to make sure that the board was compliant with its responsibilities.
We go on to page 33. As we're working through a number of the issues that crop up under the heading of water. So you say in paragraph 117, in relation to water at the hospital, I wasn't involved in anything to do with it, and I wasn't aware of the water safety group. These were meetings I wasn't involved in. Do we take that literally, that you weren't aware that there was a water safety group, or is it just that you weren't involved in it?
It was I wasn't involved in the water safety group as a member, or I did not receive the minutes of those groups. As I've endeavoured to say, the expectation was that had something come out of the water safety group that could not be resolved, then that would be reported through the appropriate scheme, and if required, I would get involved in its resolution.
Now we go on to page 34. You're shown another document. Perhaps we could just get that up. Bundle 27, volume 2, page 20. Oh, that doesn't seem to be the right reference. My apologies. Well, let's just, can we just see the title page for volume 2? No, sorry. Go back to the title page. Sorry, the next page. Right. Can we have page 5, please? Now, this is a 2015 water systems safety policy. So in existence, at least for part of the time that you were there. Can we just open that document and go on to the next page? Now, you see immediately table of contents, roles and responsibilities, chief executive, duty holder, and then a list of other people with other responsibilities. Now go on to the next page. You see under roles and responsibilities 3.1, chief executive duty holder. Now, I know to some extent this is repetitive, Mr. Calderwood, but in your witness statement at page 34, you were shown this document. The reference is slightly misleading, but it's the same document. And you say, I've never seen this. And you've shown me the page where it gives the responsibilities of the chief executive. And basically, if you've never seen it, you didn't know anyone had written this down. The reason I ask you is that it doesn't, on the face of it, appear that NHS GGC has drafted its paperwork on the basis that the chief executive essentially has nothing to do with it, just sits and waits for somebody to raise a problem. You see where I'm coming from? It's not.
No,
just
I appreciate the point that's being made. I cannot but repeat the point. I mean, in the beginning of the document, you see the authors. It's dated May 2015. Totally appropriate because of the changes in the management structures at that time, and to the best of my knowledge, the correct people were involved in drafting the document. Section 3.1 is a repetitive list of another document that's inserted here, and I have explained how the health board went about doing that. So I contend that basically the requirement for that document to be updated in May 2015 was done by the Director of Facilities, supported by Infection Control, etc., and reported to the Water Safety Group. It didn't then come to me either for approval, for information, or with a request to take any action.
And in fact, I think you say in paragraph 120 of your witness statement that the responsibilities set out in that document in that way are something you only really became aware of in preparation for appearing at this inquiry. That's paragraph 120.
Yes.
Can we go on to 166? Which is on page 49. Now, the reason you were being asked these questions, as you probably know and as we'll pick up a little later on, is that a report done in 2015 kind of foundered somewhere along its progress, and therefore there's been a fair amount of attention on it. But so far as the DMA Canyon report of 2015, which I won't bother calling up, this inquiry has seen it many times.
Yep.
And I think you saw it in the context of preparing for this inquiry. Your position is that you at least hadn't seen it before.
Never, no.
And then you asked about the delegation of the duty holders point, which you've probably covered already. I asked you about the DMA Canyon report because who saw it and when has become a matter of some controversy with lots of other witnesses. And I wanted to check that your position is you've never seen it.
No, I've never seen it. And as I say later in my statement when I was asked about it again, that the commissioning of the report in March, April 2015, to me is a fundamental part of the commissioning programme. So that, in my view, was a prudent move taken by the project team and the estate staff. The fact that it's now been shown that the recommendations made within the DMA Canyon report were not actioned is of some puzzlement to me, because having read it now, having not seen it at the time, the vast majority of the actions it requested would have been the responsibility of the contractor. So why it wasn't actioned is surprising. The fact that it was commissioned by the estates team and sent to the estates team was quite reasonable.
Possibly quite important as well.
Well, I believe so, yes.
I suppose this is. I suppose we're just trying to get our understanding of who ought to know what. We've asked this of other witnesses. This is a new hospital, got a very large and very complex water system. At least that's what we've been told. An assessment has to be made to make sure it's safe, to identify any issues, and in respect of any issues, to suggest what needs to be done about them. Something of that importance, should you as a duty holder not have known about it?
Only if the report required action to be taken that was not within the competence of the commissioning team and the estate staff. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, in reading that report, there was nothing in the report that could not have been easily actioned by the programme director as part of the commissioning programme in liaison with Multiplex and with the estates management team in relation to access to capital funding. So there's nothing in that report, having read it now, that would have, in my opinion, resulted in me being involved.
So making sure it was done would not be something that needed to be reported back to you.
Only if
good news, we've done the report or whatever.
When the project director advised me and through me the board that the building was fit for clinical occupation, these tasks should have been performed and satisfactorily actioned. That information should also have been conveyed to the operational management team that then took the decision that we were able to go ahead with the clinical movement of services into the building. And as I've highlighted in a number of points throughout my statement, there is quite a comprehensive list of tasks that need to be performed during the commissioning period to take the building from a physical entity that the contractor hands over to a clinically safe environment for patients. And that is the day-to-day responsibility of the programme director, the commissioning team, and ultimately the management team to sign off. I've mentioned in the report that the board made available significant millions of pounds in revenue to support that commissioning period in both staffing and in reference to funding.
Okay, well, I'm going to come back to some of the staffing issues elsewhere. Apologies if I seem to be fixated on single topics, but otherwise we'll get lost because they
No, I
appear
appreciate
in
that.
so many different places. Can I just ask you about one point that I think I may have touched on, but I want to make clear I have your answer. In paragraph 169, you're making the same point. Chief Executive can't do everything.
Yeah.
Fine. The Chief Executive doesn't have every technical qualification necessary to do all the technical things. No issue, I suspect, arises over that. But in the last sentence on that page, that's the Chief Executive, are obliged to ensure that a scheme of delegation exists where individuals are tasked to carry out those functions. And going on to the next page, paragraph 170, essentially you're saying, well, okay, if that's the job of the Chief Executive, ensure there's delegation in place. What did you do about it? And am I right in understanding your answer to be, you didn't actually do anything about it, you just assumed that whatever scheme of delegation was needed was in place?
Again, in relation to paragraph 170, the actual question that I was asked in relation to that was specifically in relation to when I became Chief Executive, did I set out a scheme of delegation for water? It wasn't in relation to the subsequent changes that we've talked about in relation to 2014 document, or in relation to the appointment of staff to the new Queen Elizabeth campus and their roles and responsibilities in the spring of 2015. The point I'm making in relation to that question, which is unfortunately the question not there, but the question was, did I set about a new scheme of delegation or reviewed the whole scheme of delegation in April 2009? And the answer was I didn't. I went over a number of areas, but at that time the schemes of delegation that existed were still in place. There was no structural change on my appointment.
Okay, well, so I'm clear about that. The Chief Executive doesn't do the work himself. He ensures delegation is in place. When you became Chief Executive in 2009, did you do anything to check what delegation arrangements were in place about water safety?
I cannot recall whether I specifically had discussions with the board directors about all the schemes of delegation that were in place and specifically water, no.
And you go on in subsequent paragraphs to explain that most of these delegation arrangements were found in standing orders rather than in schemes of delegation themselves, and so on. And I don't think I need delay you on these. Can we go to paragraph 175, which was on page 52? Because I think we've had discussions about delegation with various witnesses. And obviously, premise has been put to you that delegation requires the person delegating to undertake some level of supervision over those to whom responsibilities have been delegated, which includes at a bare minimum ensuring the delegated tasks are being performed. And you say at the start of that paragraph, you agree. Now, I suppose that the question is, if we're thinking about water, that type of requirement, making sure it's been done. You wouldn't have done that in relation to water because you said you would rely on exception reports coming up to you. So unless an exception report came up, you just assumed everything was fine.
I think we're looking at slightly different aspects of the same issue. The point I was making was that in my annual review of the 18 direct reports to me, which included the Chief Operating Officer and the Director of Estates and Facilities, in the performance management reviews meetings and paperwork, there would be a checklist of these schemes of delegation where they would be asked to confirm that these tasks are being performed. There was not a specific line of inquiry that was only to do with water, which, as you will respect, involved at that time probably 50 to 60 premises, because this wasn't the water issue in context of the board's responsibilities, was for every site. It wasn't unique to or specific to the Queen Elizabeth.
Was there anything specific done annually to check that the water structures for ensuring safety were in place and operating correctly?
The Water Safety Group, as I understand it, produced an annual report reflecting that the duties had been discharged. I would pick that up through my performance management meetings with the Director of Estates.
Having just sort of pausing here at the moment, one of the things that an inquiry like this does inevitably is it approaches it with the benefit of a great deal of hindsight. That's just the nature of the operation that we're doing. So I want to ask you two associated questions. With the benefit of hindsight, do you think you should have done more about water safety?
I think in the context of the day-to-day responsibilities of the Chief Executive and responsibilities set out in the Scottish Health Technical Memorandums, etc., for water safety, I don't believe there would be much more I could have done on a day-to-day basis in the period from appointment in 2009 through to 2017. I think specifically this morning we have been discussing the period around if we take operational estates issues, the period from 2015 to 17 specifically in relation to the Queen Elizabeth. Could I and should I have done more in relation to that one aspect of water? I would say that's very difficult as a Chief Executive to have taken that on board.
I think it may be suggested by some involved in the inquiry that having a situation where the identified duty holder is not aware that they're the identified duty holder or of the duties of the duty holder is not a satisfactory situation. Can you assist us on how that kind of problem might be avoided in the future in case we wish to make recommendations about it?
I would find it difficult to offer a specific recommendation about how the thing could be improved in detail. In relation to this, I would suspect that one recommendation that could be considered that would be, again, with the benefit of hindsight, beneficial, is that the annual Water Safety Group report should be presented to the board publicly so that it is seen that the actions have been taken and it's subject to wider scrutiny. That would be, I think, the way of ensuring that there's greater scrutiny of the water safety policy.
Can we move on to a slightly different topic, although it's related to water, so I'm just going to deal with it just now. Can we go to page 117? Now, you were asked about whether the water safety group would have a role in relation to taps, and of course you point out that you didn't attend the meeting of the water safety group, and you wouldn't necessarily see the minutes either. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. And then we come on to the DMA Canyon report, which you touched on earlier. You're making a point about the contractor. Is that the point you're making in paragraph 420?
Yes.
Did you have an understanding about how important the proper handling of the water system was for patient safety?
Yes.
So could we go on to page 118? First of all, you make the point you made earlier for the States Department to get the report, to commission for it, pay for it, and get it good practice. To then tell the project director in the context of opening the hospital, feel free to bring patients in next week because everything's hunky-dory. You can't understand that. Now, that suggests some kind of communication between those who received the DMA Canyon report and the project director in the context of opening the hospital. It was prepared some months after handover of the hospital had taken place, but perhaps before patient migration.
Correct, yes.
I mean, why do you say that something was said to the project director about this?
Well, in the context of that, I was making an assumption that the project director would have sought assurances from the estates that the water systems were operating and were compliant. That is a major part of the commissioning programme and the commissioning team's responsibility. Again, having looked at the report with the benefit of hindsight, there has been a breakdown in communication there. Action should have been taken, and in my opinion, reading the report, they would have been relatively straightforward to do. So I can't understand how the estates team and the project director would not be on the same page.
Well, if we go to paragraph 422, you say you didn't know the DMA Canyon report had been commissioned, you didn't know when it had been done. And you say, I had been assured that it had been done. Now, is that right? Did somebody tell you that the necessary L8 risk assessment had been done?
No, we're back here to the definite. The term L8 risk assessment is not a term I recognise. What I was told by the project director was that the water systems were operational within the hospital and fit for patients to be moved into the hospital. As I have said on numerous occasions, it is part of a comprehensive checklist of commissioning tasks that have to be performed before you accept the building. It's clinically ready. There is significant differentiation between taking the building from multiplex in February 2015 as a finished construction subject to defects, repairs, to then 100 days later confirming that the building is fit for clinical services. I have highlighted that there are areas that are discharged by specialists. So all of the major imaging equipment has to be inspected, signed off as operationally compliant. The renal dialysis unit and all of the inpatient areas need specialised treated water. That has to get certification that the water is running through the system and is meeting the purity required before any patient could be connected to the dialysis machines as an operational issue. So, and the feeders have to be commissioned. So there's a whole series of responsibilities down to, and I think I referred to it later in the statement, down to ward sisters ensuring that all of the pharmacy, all of the supplies are in the clinical area on the day or in the days before you can then see it is fair and reasonable to move patients. So it's a very comprehensive process.
And what were you told, and by whom?
Well, I was told by the project director that we were good to go. I was then told by the chief operating officer and the senior management team who were leading the patient migration that we were good to go on the particular weekend that we picked to move in the services that were then in the old Southern General Hospital. And I attended the hospital later on that Saturday to see the patients coming in and talk to some of the staff.
Was that David Loudon?
David Loudon was the project director at that time, yes.
And was this done, did you get a report? Was it a conversation? How was it done?
It wasn't a written report. It was a verbal report. There was a written report, I believe, went to the health board in the form of saying that the building is ready for clinical occupation and setting out the dates that we were planning the migration and the work that the operational team through the chief operating officer and senior directors were taking to move in. But it wasn't, that paper to the board wasn't backed up with any written reports.
Just pausing there then, I mean, if one accepts that the safety of the water system is a matter of some importance before you bring patients in, which I think you agree, correct?
Correct.
And if it's not in the state it should be, then that could have, put it no higher, consequences for the health and safety of the patients. Did it occur to you at the time that you should have got something more than a word from David Loudon to be comfortable that everything was in order?
No, I didn't at that time have any reason not to accept the information that the project director and the chief operating officer were providing to me about where we were on the process of commissioning and the context of opening.
Well, we'll just finish this section by picking up a couple more paragraphs. Can we go to 124, please? Paragraph 445. I think you're being asked here, well, what was the state of your knowledge by the time you were moving on in March of 2017? And you say you had no understanding in respect of the risk of microbial contamination of the domestic water system or the management of this. I didn't know anything about it. On the basis that the water risk in 2017, I've expected estates to have been responsible. So this is something that hadn't really crossed your consciousness by the time you left.
Well, I don't think I would use the word consciousness. The question I was asked was, did I have an understanding that there was a risk? And the answer was no, it had not been raised with me. And again, this question was in the context of the DMA Canyon report and the subsequent DMA Canyon follow-up report. And therefore that is the answer. That at the time of in the period between the hospital going operational over May, June of 2015 through to my retirement, nothing was brought to my attention about deficiencies in the water system that were not being or could have been addressed.
And just so we complete that answer, we can jump back to page 43, please. And we look at paragraph 150. You say, I've been asked when I first became aware of issues with water and ventilation. Let's leave ventilation aside. You say, I've never been aware of issues with water. That's by the time you left. You only became aware of them when you were interviewed. I think that's the independent
Correct. Yes,
inquiry team of
the
Dr.
inquiry team,
Montgomery
yes.
Fraser. And that's when this first came to your attention.
Yes, it's part of the questioning for that in the. I think that was the beginning of 2021. My colleague Dr. Montgomery Fraser commented on the DMA Canyon report, which is the first time that report came into my consciousness.
Right, let's leave that topic. Move to a slightly different part of the narrative. I want to ask you about the contract that was put in place, the structures, and some questions around that, so we can understand what you did or didn't know at the time. The particular form of contract, which has been discussed with other witnesses, I think you only touch on that very briefly at paragraph 24, which is on page 9. Now, this is where you've been describing people going out and seeing what the market would or would not tolerate in terms of proposals. And then you say in paragraph 24, the government and all the advisors, including the project team, came back and said the most attractive way we could get competition was going to the marketplace, and we should go and look at using NEC3 contract terms. Now, simple question. When you were told someone wanted to use NEC3 contract terms, was that a contract you had any experience of?
No.
So when you set out in the subsequent sentences how they were supposed to create competition and incentive and so on, that's you simply reporting something that's you've been told, is that right?
Yes, that was part of the report into the procurement strategy that went to the board, and during the discussion, NEC3 contract terms at a high level were drawn to the attention of what they brought. This was an attempt. I mean, the use of NEC3 was an attempt to try and bring in some of the disciplines that the public sector had learned from PFI procurement projects. The public sector, healthcare, have a history of projects becoming, overspent and coming in late. PFI brought the discipline to the procurement process, where in the main, PFI projects come in on time and within agreed budget variations during the process. So the aim was to try and take the learning from the PFI procurement about incentivization and about putting the responsibility for design within the contract with the construction consortia. And NEC3 was highlighted as being a contract forum common within the industry, which brought some of these disciplines to play.
Did you have occasion to work with anybody from that point on who was familiar with actually having run a contract under NEC3?
I don't believe so. In the sense, our own project team, in the context of NHS employees, would not.
But let me rephrase the question so it's clear to you. We have asked a number of participants in the inquiry if they were familiar with NEC3 in the sense of having run a contract under it, as opposed to having heard of it or having attended a seminar on it or whatever. And we haven't found anyone yet who said they were, I don't think. I just wondered whether you could remember coming across anybody who was familiar with actually operating a contract under these terms.
No, I can't identify anyone who proclaimed to have that experience.
The other question I wanted to ask you about that, and I'm sorry, I don't have the reference immediately in front of me, but one of the things that we were told when the question of contract selection, contract form selection was going to be explored with the board, what was that one of the, let me call it an issue, I won't call it a problem, let's call it an issue with NEC3 was that it put a great deal of responsibility on the project manager role. That became very important under NEC3. Now, first of all, do you remember being told that?
No.
Now, you mentioned design. And one of the issues that's cropped up in the inquiry is the extent to which the vast number of people who were helping putting everything together to make this contract come into existence appreciated the sort of way a design and build contract worked. Had you experience of operating design and build contracts?
In the context of me personally being within a project team, no. To the extent that the board had procured a number of buildings through the PFI and its successor, the PPP initiatives, then yes.
These were PFI contracts where the consortium was going to take over the building and do the main running of it for 30 years or whatever the figure was, correct?
The maintenance of it, yes, yeah. But the PFI contracts included the design.
Now, one of the phrases that crops up in looking at the structure of the contract for the new hospital, I'm sorry, I'm just calling it the new hospital to avoid getting tangled into whether it's one or two and what you call it.
Yes.
Is the phrase employer's requirements, which we've heard is actually quite a critical element of the process. You were asked about this on page 61 of your witness statement, paragraph 201, and you don't remember ever actually hearing that term before, is that right?
Employer's requirements, no. I would understand that as being the clinical specification.
So you go on, in fairness to you, to say, well, I assume it's the specification of facilities. Do we want 22 theatres or 20? Do we want set numbers of beds? Is that what you think employers' requirements are?
Yes, and obviously there's significant information contained within that. The examples I gave were very superficial, high-level examples, but yeah.
Yes, because in fairness to you, go on to say that you understood there were a whole series of clinical working groups reporting in through the project board and the finished document was presented to the board and accepted. So something that you now recognise as employment requirements came back to the board.
Yes, at a very high level, and the point I was making was that from the board paper's point of view, it was these issues that what were the departments, what were the scale of the facilities that we were seeking to procure.
Yep. And you understood that if someone was responsible for this thing called that you now think might be the employer's requirements, that would be with Helen Byrne.
Helen Byrne led that project at that time, yes.
Now, can we go to, and I apologise, my lord, the way this statement has been put together means that sometimes things that appear to be out of order arise from the way the questions have been asked as much as anything to do with the answers. Can we go to page 19? And I just want to ask you about what you say in paragraph 62 and 63. Because here you're saying, in respect of employers' requirements you previously asked about, which I'm not too familiar with, or getting reports about the proposal not complying with guidance, which was inserted into the employment requirements. You have no knowledge of things being reported to you that were not being in accordance with the employer's requirements. Am I correctly summarising that?
Correct.
And you say nothing regarding this was ever explained to me, not even by the legal team, when I was signing the contract. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you say in paragraph 63, I'm going to come back to the next point in 62 just in a moment, but this is essentially the point you made earlier. The employer's requirements were created by the project team through engagement with the clinical network. You had no involvement. And the issues of whether or not there was compliance with the employer's requirements did not come up in the groups you attended. And the only process you were involved with was design of wards and mock-up units so you could see what they looked like. Is that right?
Correct.
The reason we ask you these questions, Mr. Calderwood, is we're trying to understand what you, as a very senior board official who had some connection with what was going on, as opposed to not knowing anything about it, knew about the significance of employers' requirements in this process. What did you think they were intended to do?
Well, as I endeavour to explain in the context of my understanding of employers' requirements being the clinical specification, it was to ensure that we got the facilities that we required to the quality and regulatory standard that we had stipulated or accepted during the detailed design phase. There were, as I think comes out in the discussion, there were two stages to the award of the contract. The first stage up to December 2009, when Multiplex were, when the contract with Multiplex was signed, the design was at a very high level. I refer in the statements to being primarily 1 to 200 drawings and clinical adjacencies, with the requirement to take specific departments down to a 1 to 50 drawing. Between January 2010, after the contract was signed, through to the beginning of 2011, when the final design was signed off, all of the clinical involvements into the detailed design, where every department, every room was taken down to 1 to 50 drawings, and the M&E services and everything were signed off as acceptable, occurred in that sort of 12, 13-month period.
Okay, can we just then go to the signing of the contract? Can we go to page 86? And you were one of the signatories on the contract, is that correct?
That's correct.
And I think I have elsewhere in your statement that you were actually in and out the lawyer's offices over a period of some days because there was so much going on, is that correct?
No.
No, just the one?
Well, yeah. I was only in the lawyer's office on the one occasion to sign the contract. Our project team, our lawyers and Multiplex and their legal advisors were together for some number of days in setting out, approving and vetting the contract documentation. I think I was invited on 2 or 3 occasions to be ready to join the meeting with regard, or the group with regard to signing the contract. And then ultimately, on the 18th of December, I came alongside. I was in the lawyer's office for 2 or 3 hours leading up to the signing of the contract. And again, as I say in my statement, I was one of, at that time, only 3 board executives who had the delegated responsibility to sign contracts of this value.
What you say in paragraph 298 is that you were taken through the framework structure at a very high level in the hour before the contract documents were produced. So am I right in thinking from that answer that when you use the phrase at a very high level, you are not looking at all the contract documents, scrutinizing their content and so on and so forth?
No, I'm in that particular afternoon, I was discussing with the legal team and the project team, were we getting everything that we expected at the price that had been reported to the board, which resulted in Multiplex being appointed as preferred contractor. So there were only 2 or 3 aspects of the contract that I was seeking to ensure were watertight in relation to our responsibilities.
Well, so, okay, in your witness statement in 299, you asked a question, did you ask whether the contract delivered the same hospital which was being proposed in the outline business case? And you say, well, probably not in these words, but I did ask the project director to confirm we were getting everything we had specified for the money and in the contract.
Yeah.
And the answer to that was?
Yes.
And so far as the phrase employer's requirements, which is the one that you weren't sure you'd heard, do I take your next answer as indicating that you don't think that came up, compliance with the employer's requirements, during the advice that you got?
That's correct.
Thank you. Well, this might be an appropriate time to take the morning break.
Certainly. Mr. Calderwood, as I said, we take a coffee break. If I could ask you to be back for 5 to 12, please.
Certainly.
Mr. Connell.
Thank you, Lord. I want to ask you, I'm still sticking to issues that relate to the sort of original early period that we're looking at when we're dealing with the contract and matters relating to the contract. And what I want to ask you about is your understanding of the role played by guidance documents. The reason I want to ask you about this is that at different points in your statement, you say slightly different things, and I want to make sure we're not misunderstanding what you are trying to tell us. Now, if we go first of all to paragraph 62, which is on page 19, but this may be important. You remember we discussed the employer's requirements and the importance
Yes.
of the employer's requirements in the contract process. Now, in the latter part of paragraph 62, having quoted some questions about not complying with guidance or understanding that employers' requirements were obligatory or something not being in accordance with the requirements. You say you've no knowledge of that, nothing regarding this was ever explained to me, not even by the legal team when signing the contract. You say I was not aware of there being a distinction in the employer's requirements regarding compulsory and recommended compliance with guidance. The project team would have been aware of this. Now, if we just pause there for a moment, is that your position, that you weren't aware that there was a distinction made between guidance which was regarded as compulsory and guidance which was simply there, as the word suggests, as guidance?
Yes, at no time did I see the documentation that was shared with Multiplex in the run-up to appointing them as the preferred bidder, and therefore it is only since my discussion with the inquiry that I've been aware of the distinctions in the employer's requirements of compulsory compliance and recommended guidance to be considered.
You can understand why it might turn out to be an important distinction, just like any other provision. A provision is compulsory, a provision is simply one you have to look at and make what you wish of it.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up the other points where you touch on or around this issue. If you go to page 85, where we're talking about the 3 air changes issue, and I'm coming back to that.
Yeah.
We will come back to that. But you say in that answer, well, we're not in non-compliance, bearing in mind that the guidance was guidance. Now, that presumably is as distinct from compulsory guidance. So what you're saying there is that what you understood was that the air change rate information was merely guidance, not compulsory.
That was my understanding and the advice I received from the project team, yes.
The advice you received from the project team? This would
In the context of looking at that issue retrospectively, yes.
And when you say...
Sorry, would you maybe give me that context? Did you have a discussion with members of the project team about air change rate?
Not at that time, my involvement in the debate about air changes came when I became involved in the issue with regard to Ward 4B.
So we're talking about post 2015.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Thank you.
Yes, well, I'm going to the topic of the what's been called the ventilation derogation in due course, and I'll make sure I pick up everything that the witness says about that. But my understanding of the witness's evidence in his statement accords with what he's just told the Lord, that he was not involved at all in discussions about this until somewhere around 2013 or 14.
It would be, yes, it would be early 2000. Well, it would be part of the commissioning period and the series of debates that follow on from that with regard to the infection control team, once they had been appointed for the Queen Elizabeth complex, raising issues with regard to the suitability of various clinical areas. And at that point, I got more involved. And it was at that point that this issue of 3 air changes plus chilled beam and the acceptance otherwise of that became part of my knowledge.
Mr. Connell, just on this compulsory guidance point, to make sure that I'm keeping up, you've referred Mr. Calderwood to paragraph 62, and we can see what is said there. But what is your understanding? As I say, just to make sure that I'm keeping up.
I was intending, my lord, to refer to the discussion that we've had with other witnesses over what was contained in the employer's requirements, which obviously is a lot of technical detail, but also a list of guidance documents, some of which were allocated to a box marked compulsory, and some of which were allocated to the box to be considered, or words to that effect.
Right. Okay, I've now caught up, because quite frankly I'd forgotten that distinction in the employer's requirements.
And I think this witness says, if there was such a distinction in the employer's requirements, that was not something that came to my attention.
Correct, yeah.
And that he had been told, in the context of the air change rate debate, which we'll come back to, that the guidance was simply guidance, just that.
That's what I was subsequently told when I became involved in looking into the differences of opinion between the infection control team and the clinical users.
Yes, we'll come back to the Ward 4B issue and whether there was a debate quite in that form in due course. I'm going to deal with 4B with you separately, if I may. The only other references I wanted to pick up on the topic of guidance are two. First of all, on page 61 of your witness statement, in paragraph 205, you're asked about guidance that would have been placed for the specification of wards and ventilation. And you say there was guidance in Scotland through SHTMs, some of which were mandatory and some of which were purely for guidance. So at that point, at least, when you're asked about the SHTMs as opposed to the employer's requirements, you're aware that some provisions are intended to be compulsory and others merely for guidance. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And then the only other point I wanted to come back to, because this is where it starts to get connected to the air change discussion we'll return to. We go to page 72. You say there in paragraph 240, SHTM03 was guidance, it wasn't mandatory. So therefore, at no point had the statutory guidance not been achieved. We'll come to the description of 3 air changes plus chilled beam in due course, and also the type of patients that were anticipated. Then you say, for the client group that was in the building, the system as designed was deemed to be acceptable and compliant because SHTM03 was, as I understood it, or at least was told, guidance. Now, again, if I First of all, I'm assuming that when you say guidance, you mean as opposed to compulsory, something to be complied with.
Correct, that's what I was meaning by reference to the word guidance.
And
In a regulatory sense.
are
we talking about a regulatory sense as
sense,
opposed to a contractual?
in a contractual sense. So you were told, as I understand it from this paragraph, by someone that the SHTM 0301, which is the ventilation one, was simply guidance.
In the context of air changes, yes.
Did you have an understanding that that was the case yourself, or are you simply reliant on what you were told?
I'm reliant on what I was told, but I'm referencing this to the question about the building in total. There were specific clinical areas within the building which had different specifications.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is a generic comment about the ward areas specifically, in for the general population.
Well, we'll come to your understanding of what specialist areas there were shortly. Who told you that it was just guidance? Do you remember?
The project team.
Anyone in particular, or?
It would have come up, I think, in general conversation with Alan Seaborn when he was the project director, and more specifically with David Loudon when I got involved in the issues in 2015.
So you're not in any doubt, Mr. Calderwood. The reason we're asking you this is if you went to the employer's requirements and you looked up the list of guidance and you looked up the box marked compulsory, you would find SHTM 0301 in there.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, you were told it was just guidance.
Well, I think that we are discussing two different issues. SHTM 03, as issued by the Scottish or Health Facility Scotland, as it is now, I believe, that guidance in relation to the recommendation contained within it, suggesting 6 air changes, I was told was guidance. In the documentation that we sent to the bidders and the allegation, or not the allegation, sorry, the statement that we put it into the compulsory box, that was a choice that the project team put in the documentation. They subsequently accepted a design solution that was different. So it's the difference between the guidance being mandatory or guidance. The contract boxes are different again. They're not the same thing. If we put something into the compulsory box, but it's not mandatory on the board to achieve it, then the board's at liberty to move it out of that box, which is what I understand, with the benefit of looking at it retrospectively, is what happened.
I think I'll move on more. Let me ask you another question, just so we try and get a picture of what was the objective here. What were you trying to achieve with this new hospital? It's been given various titles, flagship, words of that kind. Now, you asked questions which sort of touch on this at various points. So I just want to pick up your answers so we can understand them. So we can think about where it ended up as against what the objective was. Now, if you go to page 18, in paragraph 57, you've been asked questions about compliance with various regulations and guidance and so on and so forth. And then you're asked in question 57 a question which suggests you might just be interested in meeting regulations, and you answer, I was interested with the project being compliant and being the best quality environment for the clinical services that we were seeking to provide. So your aim, insofar as you were involved in the exchanges, was to get the best hospital. Is that right?
Absolutely.
So you're asked what is really a follow-up question on the next page, page 19. As chief executive and wanting the hospital to be following good practice as well as being compliant with all the relevant regulations, I wasn't aware that it was or didn't or wasn't. So I can't comment on your question whether in hindsight I think it should have met all the guidance and good practice. In terms of the role you were occupying, you were obviously engaged in communications of some kind with the project team. Have some details here. Were you taking any steps yourself to try to ensure that this best hospital did comply with all the good practice, good guidance and so on?
I as an individual, didn't take on any tasks or issues out with the meetings with the project team and seeking their reports on actions that we were taking in relation to this project. I think, as I've highlighted throughout my attempted statement, is that in the period up to signing the contract and in the period up to the start of construction in 2011, the patient groups which have been the subject of comment thereafter were not in the specification for the hospital. So all of the actions that were being taken up to and including the signing off of design and the start of the construction was for a defined group of patients. Board subsequently took decisions in 2013 and then 2014 for other patient groups to be considered for transfer to the Queen Elizabeth campus.
Well, I'm not sure that, I do need to ask you about what appears to be your impression of what the patient groups were. I'm going to suggest it was not correct, but if let's leave aside what happened in 2013 and 14, because what you're talking about there are the introduction of the adult bone marrow transplant unit
Okay.
and the infectious diseases unit,
Yeah.
which we'll come to in each case. I think what I was asking you really was this: if you've got an aim in your head, this is to be the best hospital. I want this to be, top hospital, great hospital, whatever phrase you want to put to it.
Yeah.
Were you actively taking any steps to try to make sure that that happened?
Not on the day-to-day basis of getting involved in the detail. My major role in the period beyond 2011 was working with colleagues in the Scottish Government over the total capital availability and timing, and dealing with the opportunity to try and accelerate phases 2 and 3 of the scheme, which was to allow for additional investment on the Queen Elizabeth site.
We'll come back before that when the hospital, the hospital is in the design phase and then construction starts.
Yes.
Are you taking any action in your communications to try to ensure that what comes out the other end is the best it can be?
Other than reiterating the comments to my colleagues, the clinical input process was led by the Chief Operating Officer through a very comprehensive series of clinical engagements and working groups. The project director by 2010 was Alan Seaborn. Helen Byrne had moved on, and in discussions with those two individuals, I would be stressing the board's desire to get, the term you use, which I would have used as a flagship hospital for the NHS in Scotland, being constructed within Glasgow.
Well, that's probably reflected if we look in your witness statement at page 20, paragraph 66. You say the expectation was we were seeking to build and develop the best hospital possible. That's what your aim was.
It was, yes.
So we don't misunderstand another phrase that crops up. Page 39, paragraph 136. There's the phrase gold standard appears from time to time.
Mm.
I think what you're trying to do in 136 is explain what you understood gold standard was about. Yes,
the reference to gold standard was in respect of, as I say, the clinical adjacencies and the fact that a major centre incorporating regional maternity and neonatal services, the full range of paediatric services, critical care and adult specialties in adjacency is considered to be the gold standard for a major campus. And in relation to the understanding that in the hope that at that time that the expectation was that the hospital would become the West Scotland Regional Trauma Centre, the clinical adjacencies of neurosciences and spinal injuries was also considered to be linked to achieving that gold standard.
So, as you say in the answer there, if you're heard to talk about the gold standard, you're not talking about the physical environment. It's this adjacency of different services in order to achieve this bigger picture that you're talking about. Is that
correct?
Right?
Yes, I mean my use of the word gold standard is that's what we were seeking to achieve, and it was a phrase used about the clinical adjacencies.
If you were trying to get the best hospital possible, would you expect the physical environment also to be to a gold standard?
Yes, I mean, in the highest possible standard, and I think the fact that this was to date the only hospital built in the NHS of Scotland that's exclusively single rooms, the fact that there is a significant amount of public space in the atrium and other aspects of the design, that we were seeking to get that right as well. One of the lessons of history is that in the past, in trying to get the clinical services correct within the limited funds available, you squeeze the public and other patient spaces. The aim in this building was not to compromise that physical environment.
Just while we're on that page, can I just ask you about the last question on the page, simply because I'm not quite sure I understand the question fully, nor indeed your answer to it. You say the question was, at that time, was there an assumption that the hospital would be built to good practice guidelines? Do you recall anything like that? And your answer is no. I suppose is the question there, do you remember anyone saying to you, well, this hospital will be built in accordance with good practice guidelines, and you're not sure that's cropped up?
It's not a phrase in relation to when it was asked in the way that it was asked. The phrase good practice guidelines wasn't something that I would have recognised. I've already explained that we were seeking to create the best possible clinical environment and patient environment. In answer to that question, I didn't know what good practice guidelines was being referred to.
Okay, well, I'll move on from the broad aim, the hospital, and I'm now moving to another specific point in time, which is around June 2009, because I want to ask you about what we've been calling the maximum temperature variant. And when asking you about this, I'm just going to use the general figures. I'm aware that the details involve numbers of hours and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Now,
Well, do you have in mind anything beyond the range of 18 to 28, or rather, let me start that again, not exceeding 28 or 26 for 50 hours a year?
No.
I mean,
that's what I'm referring to.
Right, okay, it's as straightforward as that.
Yes. Part of my reason for asking about this, Mr. Calderwood, is you say quite a lot about it in your witness statement. It's quite a lot of detail. Is this a decision you made?
No. The reason I talk about it a lot is I was asked the same question on numerous occasions during the sessions that I gave my evidence. I didn't become aware of the decision that the project team took to ask the contractor to achieve a building that could be maintained with not exceeding 26 degrees. I explained in my statement that my understanding is that this came out of a debate with the Estates Department, which had raised the question that two other new buildings, the new Stop Hill Hospital and the new Victoria Hospital, which were similarly large glass type steel buildings, we were in the build-up of the temperature internally was making the environment challenging to both staff and patients. And their view, all of this was explained to me later, their view was that if in the ambulatory care hospital where your average working day on your average stay was less than 24 hours, and that was the build-up, the heat was too high, that in a hospital where people could be in for weeks, that we should seek to create a better environment. So therefore, asking the contractor to achieve a better ventilation solution, which kept the building cooler, would provide a better environment for the patients and staff.
Mr. Calder, my fault. It's just I didn't fully note your answer. You explained that this was not a decision you made, and I didn't become aware of it until
later, during the kind of I can't be certain of the year, but probably around about 2013-14 as part of just the project team's catch-up reports.
Thank you.
And the information that you've given us about the reasoning behind it, the information this inquiry has is that this wasn't a project team decision at all, because this was made at the point before the contractor's bid had been concluded in June 2009. Now, does that not accord with your recollection? Or?
I have no idea of the time frame when the decision was taken. My understanding is that it was an input during the design process, i.e. during the 2010-11 period when the detailed design was being signed off, and that it was one of the working groups that had been established, came up with the recommendation, and that was taken on board by the project team.
And the information you provided in today, and indeed in your witness statement about the reasoning behind it, where did you get that information from?
Well, that wasn't inverted commas information. That's a statement of my understanding of the reasoning behind going from 20 or going down from 28 to 26. The reason it kept coming back up is that people kept referring to this as being a movement away from a mandatory guidance. And the point I've been trying to get across is that this was an attempt to make the building better for the users.
Well, the question may be, first of all, who made the decision? And you think it came up in the design process.
That's my understanding.
Then did anyone, sorry, let me rephrase that question. You were obviously told about this at some point.
Yes.
Probably later on. Did anyone tell you about any assessment of the consequences that might flow from that decision when it was first made?
No.
Because obviously you can understand, I suspect, that there are lots of ways of dealing with that particular issue. But I'm just trying to understand if you were told whether they were looked at.
No, I wasn't told any detail of it. I was told that we had requested that the contractor achieve this and the reasoning behind it. And I have to say that when it was explained, I thought that was a very reasonable thing to have considered.
And do you know whether any risk assessment was done when the decision was taken?
I have no information at all on any aspect of that. As it was explained to me, it came up out of the clinical design engagement process. It was taken forward by the project team, and at no point was that reported as being resulting in consequentials that were out with the programme.
The reason I wanted to ask that is that you touch on this on page 17 of your witness statement, where in paragraph 50 you set out some of the material that you have explained to us today, the heat gain from some previous buildings and so on. And then if you go to paragraph 52, you say there, the internal temperature being allowed to rise to 28 degrees, which is the figure that is contained in the guidance document.
Yes.
Would make for a very unpleasant environment for both the patients and the member of staff. By bringing it down to 26, by bringing it down by putting in more plant to make sure the internal temperature can't rise, you create a better environment. Now, just pausing there, who told you that the answer to this issue was you simply put in more plant to bring the temperature down?
No, that's just a statement of by bringing it down, my understanding would be that you'd make it more pleasant, but you would influence the design solution. And
well,
I've used that as shorthand for putting more plant.
Well, I'm not sure that can be right, Mr. Calderwood, with respect. If putting in more plant, if that was the assumption, well, let's bring the temperature down. That'll just mean the contractors will need to put in more plant to achieve that.
Yeah.
But two things about that. One, there's a possible cost consequence if there's to be more plant, which were you told whether that was assessed?
As I've explained, I wasn't told anything about this in the real time that the decision was taken and enacted. I picked up on it later. But the point I've been trying to make in answering these various questions is when it was mentioned to me in passing, I did at the time and still think that it was a good thing to do to make the building more capable of being controlled to improve the environment for the users. And the question kept coming up as it being something that was a deviation from a mandatory guidance, which is, to my understanding, not.
It was deviation from standard guidance, because that's where the 28 figure came from, wasn't it?
Yes, but guidance, had we gone the other way and allowed the building to go to 30 degrees, we would have been out with the guidance. To narrow the parameters is not going out with the guidance, and I am trying to say that it was put forward in good faith to try and improve the ability to create a better environment for the users. I've explained numerous times in my statement, and I continue today. I think that was a good thing to try to do. To the extent that the project team did work to assess the consequence of that, I don't know what they did, but it clearly didn't take them out with the parameters of their delegated authority to proceed, because they didn't have to come back to the board for more money or for a delay in the project.
The reason I asked you about the timing was that our information is that this was a decision made not by the project team, but by someone in estates who now can't remember it. And it was made in
Mr.
around
McIntyre.
Mr. McIntyre in the estates team in around June 2009, when the contractor's bidding and design process was still well underway. So it wouldn't be a question of busting the project team's budget, because you're not at that point yet. You see where I'm coming from?
Well, no, I'm not actually getting away from it. To go, if we're talking about the project and the budget, at the time, the exemplar design, i.e. the design produced by the board project team against which the project costs had to be assessed, that budget was £628 million for the exemplar design. All three of the final bidders produced designs and costs that were below the 628 million. Two of them by significant sums, one by only a few million. So when the board agreed to Multiplex being the preferred bidder, the 628 million, which was in the project, was replaced by the Multiplex bid, which at that time, my memory, forgive me, I'll not be right by a few million, but was about £554 million. So it didn't have a budget consequence from day one. And when the detailed design was worked up subsequently, to get to the situation at the end of, at the beginning of 2011, when the final price was signed off, that had not moved materially from the original. So much so that we were then able to submit the final information to the Scottish Health Directorate Finance Department, saying that in moving from preferred bidder to detailed design, the final price was X, and it was within the parameters that allowed the board to proceed.
So the comment in your witness statement about adding more plant, you can't tell us as of today where that came from.
No, the statement I made in relation to just a general concept of if you improve something, you normally, very common, put in more plant. It's got nothing specifically to do with this detailed of this scheme. That was just my phraseology.
And you're asked in paragraph 55 on page 18, if you know who was involved in the decision now, or who you understood to be involved in the decision, and you say, well, the operating team, chief operating officer and their staff, but you can't say whether anyone from the clinical team was involved.
Correct.
The reason I asked you about the plant was I was wondering, maybe you can help us, if anybody who was qualified to understand the possible consequences of changing the maximum temperature was involved in the decision-making process.
Well, in the context of the time frame that you're talking about, in the sense of the information was contained in the guidance to bidders. At that point, my understanding is that the M&E experts on the project team were Wallace Whittle.
Were you told whether they'd been involved or not?
As I've explained, I was never involved in any discussions in the period about this issue until it came up in discussions. And as I say, I can't remember the exact time, but somewhere around about 2013, early 14.
And you've made elsewhere the comment that you think this was a good thing, and you've explained why you think that was the case. So I won't take you back to that. So just bear with me. Can we just go briefly to page 71, just in case we've moved on from what's said there? See at the top of that page, you say, I don't know when I first became aware of the removal of the maximum temperature variant. You now think it might have been 2013 or 2014?
Yes, I mean, I truthfully don't know exactly when. As I said in my statement, it came up in conversation. And I didn't regard it as anything material then, and as I said, I still don't regard it as material now.
You just regarded it as a possible improvement to the patient environment?
Well, I genuinely believe it is an improvement to the patient environment.
Well, let me leave the topic of the maximum temperature variant and move to the not unconnected topic of the what we've been calling the ventilation derogation. Now, don't get into a definitional debate with me just yet over that. It's just the label we've been using for
Yep.
it, which is the 6 air changes, 3 air changes primarily. Now, you've asked quite a lot about that in your witness statement, so I'll need to work through quite a lot of your comments to make sure we have your evidence on it. Can I just pick up, first of all, a phrase that you used earlier, and a phrase that also appears, and we can see it in due course in your witness statement, which is 3 air changes plus chilled beams. Now, that's the way you use the phrase.
Yes.
Does that suggest that chilled beams are adding something to the air changes?
Technically, I don't know the answer to that. It's just always been referred to me as being, when I got into it in more detail dealing with the operational issues later, it was always referred to me as 3 air changes with chilled beam. My therefore deduction from that was that it did add something to the ventilation. It was a critical part of the ventilation strategy.
So you kind of shifted your phraseology there. So let me make sure I'm getting it clear. Did you understand it added something to the ventilation, or was it just part of the strategy?
My understanding is it was part of the strategy that the project team accepted in the design solution.
Well, let's pick this up then from one of the first times it's touched on in your witness statement in paragraph 75, which is on page 22, where you repeat your comment about the temperature variant being a positive thing. then you're saying regarding the decision about departure from guidance in respect to the chill beams, well, that was made by the team and they documented, as I understand it, the reason for that. It wasn't reported to the board and it wasn't mentioned to me until much later, when it was mentioned not in a way as it being or not being an acceptable outcome. So can we just try and take the different elements of that answer if we can? The decision about the air change rate, you say, was made by the team. That's the project team, presumably.
Correct.
It wasn't reported to the board, is that correct?
It was not, no.
And it wasn't mentioned to you until much later. Now, can we get any estimate of when much later is?
No, no. It would be after the construction started.
And your sentence there ends and said it was mentioned not in a way as it being or not being an acceptable outcome. Can you just help me understand what you're trying to say there?
Well, I'm sorry to keep coming back to this, but the questions that I was being asked at that time was regarding what you refer to as derogation, and I accept that we're discussing derogation in the context of the contract and employers' requirements as opposed to mandatory derogation. During the interview process, it was being presented as being a derogation from the mandatory guidance as opposed to the employer's requirements column. And the point I was making was that it wasn't mentioned to me as being anything other than delivering an acceptable outcome.
Yeah, I think the question that we can put to you would be largely on the basis that the standard guidance, both in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK, for air changes for a general patient room, and that's my phrase, it's probably not the correct technical one, was for 6 air changes. And that was the same whether it was a single room or not. Were you aware of that?
No.
I think it may be suggested to you that 6 air changes was then and has continued to be the standard specification for the number of air changes proposed for a standard room in a hospital. You weren't aware of that?
No, not in the technical sense and the detail.
You say in paragraph 76, a number of hospital projects since we built this one have got less than 6 air changes. You might struggle to find a hospital in Scotland that's got 6 air changes. Now, that might come as something of a surprise to the Scottish Government, whose guidance it is, but what do you base that on?
There are very few, up to the period of 2010, hospitals were being constructed with that kind of ventilation system. The point I was making, in ward areas, we're talking here now of the general hospital environment, not the specific environments of theatres or ITU or other critical care areas.
Okay, first, I use the phrase standard ward room, single room.
Yes, well, the majority of build in Scotland up to that point, and indeed some since, are 6-bedded bays, open plan areas with limited single rooms, and not sealed buildings.
Well, can I just sort of take you through paragraph 76? As I understand it, at the time the hospital was being constructed, that's up to 2015.
Yes.
You had not been aware that the current guidance expressed in SHTM 0301 was for 6 air changes per hour in general wards. You had not been aware of that fact, or have I failed?
No, Mal, yeah, I was not aware of the detail of it. I became aware of the issues during the latter part of the construction and the operational part of the hospital, where issues concerning the acceptability of certain areas was challenged.
Well, I'm asking you about the detail. The figure 6, when did that first come to your attention?
It's part of that engagement process.
Do you mean in 2013 or later?
Probably 2013 onwards.
Right. Now, in the paragraph 76, you say a number of hospital projects since we built this one have got less than 6 air changes.
Yes.
Which hospital projects are you referring to?
That's just a general statement I made personally.
Well, what?
I can't point you to a named hospital or environment. It's
Well,
just
it's a general statement upon which I might rely. Are you saying it has no factual basis?
I'm just saying I can't at this moment in time point you in the direction of some projects.
That has got less than 6 air changes.
Yes, I can. No, I mean that was a statement I made, and I'm happy to correct it or to add to it is my belief. It's not a fact that I can point you in the direction of.
I mean, you would accept it's not really the sort of piece of information that is usually regarded as a belief.
No, I understand in the context of the statement, but when I made the statement, that I made that as a personal statement. It was recorded, and therefore I said it, and I accepted that it would go into my statement. I couldn't delete it because I did make it.
Thank you.
Let's just continue to make sure we understand what you did or didn't know on this topic. And I apologize again for the fact that we're jumping around in the paragraphs, but page 70. What you've been referred to at the foot of that page in paragraph 233 is a document about removal of the maximum temperature variant. We know about that. And then you'll see there's a quote from what's been put to you, that on around 28th May 2009, a document called NSGH Project Issue 01 Maximum Temperature Variant was produced for NHGGC. The first page is reproduced, that's the first page of the temperature variant document, as it appears to be relied upon as a reason for the ZBP ventilation strategy document in 2009. Now, I think the question was probably directed at whether you were aware of something called the ZBP ventilation strategy document in 2009.
No.
And are you aware of any discussions? I have to watch the phrase "the board" because the phrase "the board" appears in lots of communications when it doesn't actually mean the group of people at the top of the tree. But any discussions with anyone for NHGGC on that document? That's something you know about?
No. At that point, all of this communication between the contractors would be through the project director.
And then the actual ventilation strategy paper, which we can put on screen if you would like, but you may remember it. It's referred to in paragraph 238. Maybe we'd better just put it up. It's bundle 16, page 1657. Now, I don't need to take you through this because this is a document that we know was produced by ZBP, as the previous reference indicated. Is your position that you hadn't seen this document before it was put to you in preparation for the inquiry?
Correct.
Although you qualify that to some extent in paragraph 238. You say, this is something I wasn't aware of. But I was briefed on it later, probably 2014 in the run-up to handover. Now, the something that you were briefed on, is that the link between maximum temperature and air change rates?
I can't comment on that question in the sense of what we were discussing at the time. I mean, the document, which was obviously prepared by the project team and sent to the contractors I had never seen before, which we've just seen, we have gone over my understanding of the 26 degrees and my understanding of the 3-year changes subsequently, and that was, as I say, in the period after construction.
You say at the end of 238, it was not deemed as a major issue. Now, is that the reduction in air change rates from 6 to 3, or about 3?
I think that was in reference to both the 6 to 3 and the 26 degrees. And I'm saying it was not deemed a major issue by the project team and not reported to the board.
But mentioned at some point shortly before handover.
I attended bi-monthly walkabouts on the construction site, either in accompanying Scottish Government officials or with the project team, and chaired a bi-monthly meeting to oversee the project delivery and timescale and finance. And it would be during one or more of these meetings that these issues could have been raised and discussed. But it was not a specific session linked to ventilation.
Well, let me ask you about this. Taking your point you made earlier about the 6 air changes not being applicable to places like theatres or ICU or anywhere else that has special ventilation requirements for
Yes.
more than that. The areas to which 6 might have been thought to apply would be every other single room that didn't have any special requirements, which would be a very large number of rooms in your new flagship hospital, correct?
Yes.
So if the guidance, let's not get into the compulsory point again, the guidance in SHTMO 301 for all of these rooms was 6.
Yeah.
And you were proposing to build this flagship hospital with a level at 3. Now, did it never occur to you that this was, at the very least, possibly controversial?
As I have explained, rightly or wrongly, I was not involved in the decisions taken to go for the ventilation strategy chosen. So I can't comment on the detail. On the basis of reading a number of papers that have been sent to me by the inquiry, I believe there is papers setting out the thoughts of the project team when they decided to go with the ventilation strategy that was proposed and subsequently accepted by them. At no time at that stage was I involved in the project. So if you had asked me in 2010-11 what I understood to be being built, I would not have known in the context of, if you'd asked me in the street, well, why did you go from 6 to 3? I wouldn't have known at that point that we were indeed going from 6 to 3. It was within the scope of the project team to take forward.
I'm only asking that because you're the you know, you're the man at the top of the pyramid. You're the chief executive. You're paying some attention to the new build because it's a big thing for the board. You're on site. You're attending discussions, and it appears someone tells you that 306 is being proposed.
No, had been accepted. It was never presented to me as a proposal for discussion. At the time I became aware of the 6 for 3, the hospital was materially under construction.
Okay, well,
I think I fail to get across. I did not, whether I should have, I doubt I had the time, but whether I should have spent more time on the detail of the project when I had a chief operating officer, 7 directors, a project team consisting of 40 staff or so with external consultancy advice. I was confident that these people were taking forward the project comprehensively. At that particular time, the board's priority for me was to spend time with the local authorities to establish what are now health and social care partnerships, what at that time were community care organisations.
well, can I just try and ask the question again, and we'll see if my meaning will become a little clearer this time. I accept, of course, your wide range of responsibilities and concerns. Fine. At the point when you were told about this, you were not engaging with community care. You were going round the hospital with somebody, having a look, chatting to the project team and others, correct?
Yeah, and I attended the site bi-monthly, so half a dozen times a year or so, and that typically broke into 2 kind of phases. There was a kind of formal meeting in the project team's offices on site, and then there was a visit to a specific area, which was mainly just to look at the finish kind of thing. As I've explained later in my statement, a lot of these issues with regard to whether things were done right or wrong were down to the validation process, which under terms of contract was delivered by Capita to say that what we had asked for, what Multiplex had contractually agreed to build, was in fact what was constructed. That the process for validation of that was through Capita. And during these either formal meetings or in the general walk around thereafter, points would be made, drawn to my attention, but there was no. I've tried to explain. There was no formal sit down and saying these are proposals that we are making, which are at odds with or different to guidance that we think you should be aware of.
Okay. Let me try this again, and let me introduce my question by pointing out that one of the issues that emerged in many pieces of the evidence that inquiry has heard is that when people came to the new hospital, clinicians, IPC, the whole team turned up in the new hospital, nobody appeared to know that the air change rates were not those specified in the Scottish guidance. Let's stick to the 6 and 3 for the moment.
Yes.
We can come to this because you deal with a new witness statement. But the point is, people turned up and went, what? Surely it should be 6. That's what the guidance says. So nobody had that knowledge on the face of it. So what I'm trying to ask you about is, you're going around 2014, so before the opening, you're having these informal sessions, or more or less informal sessions, and somebody tells you something to the effect that they're not building to the guidance of 6, they're building a figure of 3.
Yeah.
Now, I suppose the question I then ask is, given that this wasn't, the air change rate for room 329 for some special reason, this was the air change rate for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rooms.
Yeah.
Did it occur to you at the time to say, whoa, what? Hang on a minute. Have I got that right? Am I understanding it? Is this going to cause an issue with anybody else? Do I need to report it to somebody? Did any of these things go through your mind?
I can't say with certainty what went through any of those discussions. I did ask, were we certain in the process that we had in place to accept the ventilation strategy that was agreed? I was assured we had been. I was assured that the design solution was acceptable. As I say, in some of the documents you sent to me, one of them is the minute of the meeting where the project team discussed the ventilation strategy, and there were quite a number of people in attendance. There was infection control staff seconded to the project team. I accepted the view that they had debated it and come to that conclusion.
My fault entirely, Mr. Calderwood. Could I ask you just to repeat that answer?
In the context of the
it's. I just didn't manage to make a note.
Yeah, sorry. In the context of the question, did it cross my mind to interrogate why it wasn't 6 and we'd accepted 3? I was asked by council whether it hadn't crossed my mind to do that. I'm saying that when I had the general discussion, I was told that the outcome of the ventilation strategy had been debated with the project team and accepted and was acceptable.
Right, just maybe a little slower. I've been told the outcome of the ventilation strategy, and that's a reference to the document you referred to.
Yes.
The outcome of the ventilation strategy had been
debated by the project team and was deemed acceptable.
And by the project team, do you mean simply the in-house?
The in-house team, supported by the external consultants, that would have been invited to give an opinion on the technical competence of the solution.
Thank you. Sorry,
Conscious of the time, my Lord.
Right. Well, we'll take a lunch break and maybe try and reconvene at 2:05.
Thank you.